And in her value set, she's got the large and the small, but I want to show you guys the difference between the medium one that's not in the kit. Right? A lot of people think that, you know, they like the smaller one, but just remember it's how you play around with this brush to manipulate it. You can make it a little bit smaller by just tapping on the forward or the back part of it. Right? So if you look at the width of the medium and the width of the large, they're the same. The only difference between these two brushes is one's longer than the other. Right? So when you're doing these small little donuts for your sunflowers, right, you definitely have to play a little bit differently with your bigger one, but you really don't need the medium one. I hardly ever use it once I really realize that they're the same width, right? You get the extra length for it if you want it. Okay, so the first thing we usually do when we're doing sunflowers is we definitely gotta be quick at things, right? So you definitely wanna have your brushes ready and loaded. Right, so you have your two colors of yellows, your yellow ochre and your daffodil. Right, so it's always good to get that brush kind of worked in and ready. And then I always add a little bit of white into my daffodil just to give me a little bit better coverage. Okay, so I'm coming over away from my puddle here now. Okay, so I've got that ready. And then I'm going to come over and grab my two browns, start working that in. All right, so this is just your burnt sienna or light bark brown. And you can add a little tiny bit of yellow ochre in there if you want. I'm accidentally hitting mine, but definitely able to lighten things up a little bit. All right. So we're usually starting our little donut, right? So you're flat straight up and down, you're getting both colors. But if you flip over on the top part, you can get just the light. If you flip back, you can get just the dark. If you flip over on the side, you can give yourself a skinnier little area. You see that? So it's all about how you press down with this scruffy brush. Right, so sometimes we need it to be full size. When you want that dark, you're going to come around in like a U-stroke. Then you're going to come down, pick up some more of that paint, and then come down in your little circle. Right, so it's a full circle that you're doing. Right, and then while this is nice and wet, right, so I want to make sure that this is really good and wet. When you pull over your strokes in this wet paint now, right, you usually start off at the top where it's a little lighter so it doesn't end up dirtying your brush too much. You're just barely touching the outer edge of your donut, and then you're pulling this out and with a flat back one stroke leaf. So you can see that I'm actually pulling some of that wet paint out. You can press, overlap slightly, and pull out. A little bit of a slide, right? So it's a little bit longer petals, make it look a little bit more even, right? So this is your flat back, right? One stroke leaf. You can go a little bit at an angle in there too if you want, right? Doesn't have to be totally flat. Pull through. Always going back, refreshing my brush. Then I go over to the top, starts changing directions. Right, so if you want to make this smaller, definitely you can use a smaller brush. Use an 8 or a 10. But to show you guys, right, so that's a little bit of a bird's beak. Right, so you gotta be even on both sides, slowly turn so you have that hump on both sides. It's very common especially when we're doing the sunflower. You end up not smoothing slow enough. Right, and then you end up with, you're drawing with your brush and you're gonna end up with that bird beak. Right, Right, so it's pressure on both sides of the brush, slowly pulling it out. Right, pull through. Guys, see my mess over here? Pull through. Right, get those really nice streaks going through there. And then if it's starting to dry, then you won't get that color in there. Right, so this is why we gotta sometimes work a little bit quick so we can pull that streak out. You see how I just fixed that little area? It was starting to dry. So don't be afraid to kind of add a little bit of wet paint in there. If you feel like you're going too slow, and then by the time you get down here, you're not getting those streaks anymore. Alright, so we don't want to go too far in, because then it's going to pull too much brown. So it's just the very edge of the color that you're actually pulling out. Then you can come back with your scruffy brush again. And then I definitely like to add a little bit more of that yellow ochre, but I really want to have the three browns. I want to have the dark, and I'm trying to pick this up in the middle, and I'm picking up a little bit of the yellow ochre. Right, so then when you come over your donut again, you're slightly going over the edge just to soften the edge of those strokes. Right, just to make it a little bit freckly. And then if you want to add just a little bit more brighter yellow in there, you can add some, and really light touches, guys. When you're doing this, at first you're pushing really hard, but when you want to freckle, you have to kind of touch very, very lightly. Right, because you're going right into wet paint, and we want to leave that paint behind. Right, so a lot of people are pushing too hard when they're starting to lighten up and trying to get that extra little layer. Right, so remember, there's a lot of pressure, medium pressure, and then very, very little pressure. Just like all of our stroke work, right? If you want to make these petals a little bit smaller, right, less pressure. If we're really pushing down hard, we are going to get really huge petals. Right, so learning how much pressure are you doing, right? Are you pushing it all the way down 100%? Then you're going to get the maximum width. If you push down a quarter of the way, you're going to get a smaller one. If you press down half of the way, you'll get a medium one. Does that make sense with pressure? That's where I think a lot of people are getting all caught up with their stroke work as well. Right? Because sometimes you see Donna pull out a 3/4 and she's like making the smallest thing. And I was like, how did you fit that in there? She actually, I do too. I'm starting to embrace the bigger brush to do a smaller stroke. If you have to really push that stroke to make it that big of a brush, a big of a petal, then you need to go bigger brush. You're overworking that size of brush. You're trying to make it work way too hard. Right? You're better off to get that 3/4 or 16. Right? And you don't have to push so hard to get that size.